tell a lie, you always have to remember the lie you told and who you told the lie to. If you just tell the truth, you don't have to remember what you actually said because it comes naturally. And I think that's the truth in being a person, being the truth in what you write, who you represent, how you represent it, what you did yesterday, what you're going to do tomorrow, and then follow through on what you do. Hi, my name is Ashley Jones and I'm a columnist at elitefts. So I grew up in Australia and I was very fortunate to be adopted at 6 weeks of age into a family that moved to the beachside when my parents were married and got to grow up along the northern beaches of Sydney. I played rugby all my life growing up, and I was very fortunate to make some representative teams as a younger player, and I thought that's where I was going to spend a lot of time getting into high representative honours, but I think I must have matured too early and people started catching up to me, and I've got the shoulders of a black snake, so they're not the widest shoulders in the world, so they copped a bit of damage, and suddenly there was quite a few shoulder subluxations, and that was it. And I just couldn't take the pain anymore, and decided that what was the best way of staying involved in the sport that I loved, and I started doing PE teaching as a career choice. But within a year of going to teachers college, I realised that I didn't want to be a teacher, I wanted to be a coach. And back in 1978, when the National Strength and Conditioning Association was first formed, I was fortunate enough to start reading their journal in 1980 when I first went to teachers college, and I was hooked from then on in, and basically followed that pathway, went back to college to get my master's degree and tried to coach as much as in between, and became a professional coach in 1992, and haven't worked probably a day since then, just because I've enjoyed it too much. Well, I cut my teeth in basketball, so I had a really good American coach by the name of Bob Turner with the Sydney Kings organisation in Sydney. And I was really fortunate because I'd been to an NSCA conference not long before that and had seen what some of the basketball guys were doing over here. And they gave me a trial and did some warm-up drills on court with the guys, and the owner suddenly saw what I was doing, and he'd just come back from the Lakers. And we were a purple and gold team like the Lakers were. He immediately saw what I was doing, and he said he'd seen the same thing done with the Lakers, so I must know what I'm doing. So I got hired into my first position, so it was pure luck that he was around there, otherwise I may not have even got going from there. Well, I thought I was going to be in Australia the rest of my life, to tell you the truth. As much as I wanted to come to the United States and live, I knew it was going to be difficult. I'd moved over here in 1990 to work for the NSCA organisation in Nebraska. Unfortunately, we couldn't get the correct visas organised, so I had to go home. And otherwise, things might be a completely different story. But in 2003, I saw a job advertised for a position in Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand. And it was with the Crusaders organisation, which was the premier rugby organisation in world rugby. And I'd met the current strength and conditioning coach then at a conference I was speaking at in Auckland about 18 months, 2 years before. And I said to him, if you see anything in rugby, I would love to move across into rugby if keep me in your ideas. And suddenly the job came up, and he did. And interviewed for the job, was fortunate enough to get the job, moved to New Zealand in 2003, and have more or less been there ever since, apart from stints around in other countries. And people probably started taking notice of what I was saying, even though I haven't changed what I've been saying since I was in the 90s and in the 80s. It was primarily because the team I was with had two generational players. They had Richie McCaw and Dan Carter, two of the best players of their generation in their respective position. And I would say that irrespective of what I did, we'd win 80% of our games with those two players. Reality was, I think people give some of us coaches a lot of too much kudos, if you like, because obviously it's the players that do the job, and when you've got two generational players like that, we're going to be fairly fortunate. So then I had a reputation as far as rugby is concerned, and jobs came up in Japan, jobs came up in Scotland, and it was pretty much be a case of being at the right place at the right time. And I think I've gone on to say a lot of things that probably who you know will get you an interview, and what you do and who you are, more importantly, will get you the job. That's a really, really good question. Unbelievable question. I think obviously there's cultural differences everywhere, and even though you had a successful team culture in, say, Canterbury and Christchurch, to think that you're going to pick that up and transport that to another organisation, or even within New Zealand, let alone overseas, it's just being foolish. I think you've got to go in, and I've heard of some horror stories. I mean, there was one team in Japan that people have told me who've been there that said that the strength and conditioning coach basically destroyed the team culture within 12 months because he didn't take into consideration what the Japanese were like in the first place and what their culture had and what they brought to the strength and conditioning mix. So I think it's a matter of, first and forward, having your own strong principles about what you want to accomplish with the team, then knowing what the team personnel's like, and then you may have to chop and change. I think one of the arts of strength and conditioning with teams is compromise. You may not be able to get everything that you want done in the first year, but hopefully you get a second year and a third year to actually try and make that selective small changes over a period of time to actually get the results. And usually in rugby it's not as cutthroat as football in say the United States or football in Europe as far as soccer is concerned, where if you don't win you don't basically stay around for very long. So I think the cultural aspects probably more in non-English speaking countries. I think the time that I've had in Japan and Samoa, even though English is spoken obviously quite a lot in Samoa, you still want to try and speak as much Samoan cultural language as possible, and also in Japan even more so. I think it actually makes you a better coach when you go back to your native language, because you have to get in your own mind 100% clear of what you're expecting and what you want, because in some cultures everything will be taken quite literally, whereas you can get away with some sort of jokes as far as that's concerned when you're speaking your own language. If you're not 100% clear when you're trying to get that translated, then as Bill Murray will tell you, things get lost in translation. I've gone back to the basics. I think that's what I've probably been pushing a wee bit, and particularly the last couple of articles here at Elite FTS, is how important simplicity is. And I think coaching in foreign countries makes you really appreciate that strength and conditioning is quite a simple task to get done. I think people tend to complicate it far too much, and I think that's the key issue that I'm trying to get across as far as the articles are concerned, and I think a lot to do with living overseas and working overseas has been the driving force behind those new articles. I learned when I was very, very young, I think. I was captaining the under-16 Australian team, under-17 team, and I'd done my time in the under-16s in Sydney. And there was a club captain of Randwick by the name of Alan Norley, and Randwick was a suburb in Sydney. And I saw he'd been really successful in captaining the team that he'd been working with. And I sent him a letter, not expecting to get a reply. And it was basically, how do you lead men into battle, basically in sport, week in, week out, and what do you do? And he was probably in his late 20s, early 30s at that stage, and I was only 16. And he sent me an 8-page handwritten letter in reply. Didn't have to do it, could have just thrown it away, and it was actually addressed to Alan Norley, club captain, Randwick Rugby Club, Coogee, New South Wales, Australia. They picked it up, took the time to write it, and then basically I met him a couple of weeks later when his club team played my club team out in our home area, and again he said, I've got some club duties to respond to, but if you hang around for half an hour, 45 minutes, I can have a good chat to you. So I did, and he had to be pulled onto the team bus that was going back to his side of the city. But he spent all that time, about an hour and a half, just talking to some kid who was interested in seeing how he approached the role as a captain of a team. So I think from that day on, I've always believed that if someone takes the time to firstly read what I have to write, which I'm still amazed to this day that people take the time to actually read the simple musings of a strength coach like myself, but then to actually write a comment or to ask a question for clarification, I think it's what I need to do to clarify some point of interest, or to give information that hopefully can, if someone makes them a better coach, or they can actually use the information to help someone else. I think it becomes almost generational. You become You're not the father of you might be the father of the article, but then you become the grandfather and the great-grandfather of whoever's reading it down the track from there. So it's actually, I think it's more an honour and a privilege to actually be able to help people like that way. What's the why of why we do something? If we then know the why we do that, the how and the what comes pretty easily after that, I guess. So I think that's what I'd like to be most impactful for. And I'd like to think that the legacy I leave in this industry is one that it doesn't need to be complicated. And I think that's what I'm going to be pushing all the time now, is that simplicity is not a dirty word. And if you try and complicate the issue, you're basically lost. You should be able to try and explain things as simply as possible. The hard thing is getting people to do unnatural things, to push themselves to those limits, those dark places. And that becomes more a psychology issue than a physiology issue. So it's the importance of the simplicity of programming, but the complexity of getting people to do things, which I think that's where I want to be.